So welcome to Essentials of Business Security. This is us from 1Password talking to people who are key in the security industry. And we have today Troy Hunt. So you might know him from Have I Been Pwned? Or recently you put out a report with the UK National Cyber Security Centre. So that was really cool to see. There was it's nice to kind of scare people with plain text passwords sometimes when when Have I Been Pwned obviously keeps the privacy up there. But that got a lot of news reports.
Yeah, I was actually surprised of how much coverage it got. And I got to say, it scares me as well when I look at the passwords and you just go, oh my God, what are you thinking? But, I guess the people are just doing what we anecdotally know that they do. But when you see them all in front of you, it's still a bit of a shock, isn't it?
Yeah, I've wondered always whether there's a list of football teams that you can just block from the password field and just we'll just guess that they're bad.
Well, I think if we sort of work on this assumption that there are bad passwords from data breaches that we probably shouldn't use anymore, I suspect that every football team and every variation of a name of a football team is probably in there somewhere or other.
That's true. Although maybe not some football teams. Like some terrible ones, I bet no one thinks I wouldn't use that regardless.
Well, looking at the numbers in Have I Been Pwned at the moment, there's about 551 million unique passwords from data breaches, and I reckon within there, even the bad football teams are in there. Even the kids football teams in really far-flung places are probably in there because there's more than 500 million passwords.
That's crazy. So when it comes to business. Passwords seem like the kind of first layer of security for an organization. But where should a business start when it comes to setting up these layers and what do you think they look like?
I think passwords, when we think about layers, it's always sort of the coalface, right? Like passwords are the things that all the consumers work with. It's one of the first things we think about when we consider security. And I think one of the things that businesses should be thinking about now is what are today's good password management practices? And I'm thinking about this. I actually did a workshop today where I was talking to a lot of people about here is how our views of how passwords have changed over time. And I sort of talk about, in the beginning, we wanted to have lots of randomness in terms of you've got to have uppercases and lowercases and entropy and things like that. And that was okay for a while. And then I sort of said to people, what do you do when you go to a website and you try to create a password and the website says, you got to have a special character? And they're like, well, you put an exclamation mark on the end, of course. And I was sort of saying, does this actually make the password stronger? Because you do that. I know you do that. The hackers know you do that. So, how is this a strength thing? So we're talking a lot about sort of the old ideas of password composition and mandated password rotation and the way these things are now changing. So I think the first thing for businesses is to understand that we do have a different view of passwords today of what constitutes a good password and how we should help them create it. And the likes of the NCSC have been very good at sort of resetting expectations around passwords. The NCSC has said, look, you should only force users to rotate their password on suspicion of compromise. That's very different to the old thinking of let's do it every 90 days.
Yeah, some places are really terrible and have a 30-day policy. And I'm like, someone is just putting a 1 or a 2 on the end of that. Or, I've heard horror stories of people just having bands. Huge bands, they've got 40 members and they just rotate between each member of the band. And or football teams again, and they have they just rotate through players. And when you see one in plain text, it makes it very obvious that there is a pattern. And so rotation just really doesn't help.
The humans will always find a way, right? The humans will go, there's this piece of technology, it's getting in my way. I'm going to find a way of sort of short-circuiting the path between me and doing the job that I'm here to do in the first place. And I think that's sort of really important to recognize. And this is where we're now getting guidance around dropping things like mandated rotation, where we're starting to say, look, rather than just the mathematics of what makes a strong password, the entropy or the character space, let's look at the human behavior as well, which I think is a really kind of mature approach to take. So it'll sort of be interesting to see how long this thing takes to get traction. I tweeted something the other day. Microsoft is changing some of their baseline requirements to actually drop mandated rotation. And a bunch of people are like, yeah, but we need to be PCI DSS compliant and they still demand rotation. So it's like, okay, well, you're going to have to rotate until you get past that actual regulatory requirement. So it's going to take some time.
But the fact that Microsoft are doing it and other huge companies joining in. It should start that wave.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I guess that the thing we've got to accept is it's going to be a transition period, right? It's not like we're going to go, okay, I'm glad we all agreed on that. Let's do everything new again. Look, it was a couple of years ago that both the NCSC and NIST were putting out guidance around mandated rotation. And Microsoft is like literally just the week before recording this said, you're right, we're going to change our baseline requirements. It might be another 2 years or 3 years or 5 years or something before PCI DSS does, but it will happen over time, and then we'll worry about the next thing we have to deal with.
So when you do these courses and talk to these businesses, who is the kind of market that you're educating, and how are they then educating the rest of their team?
Really depends on the event. So I'm doing a conference which joyfully is actually walking distance from my home this week, before I go to the other side of the world again next week. And in this particular conference, it's mostly software developers. So it's people building systems. And I really like talking to these guys because it's, my background's software development, so we're on the same wavelength. But it's also people that are building the systems that ultimately are going to be the ones that enforce these rules. And, inevitably they have to sort of work with business and figure out what these rules are going to be, but they're literally the ones that have to write the code. So I really like kind of getting to them because they're at the coalface of this implementation. And I hope that when they go back to the office in a couple of days' time, they're sort of saying, hey, look, we went and did this course. We learned about things like mandated rotation and how the industry standard is changing. And hopefully they get to influence a little bit. And then the people they influence might influence a little bit more, and the whole thing kind of propagates.
What we found is that, like, when talking to someone, the usability really matters. It's all right to kind of put out guidelines from the top down that say, like, hey, please don't do this and please don't do this. But if you build it right from when someone starts, of like, okay, here's a password manager, we want you to generate all passwords, and then, like, build it into the almost the user experience of joining a company. We find that that works wonders. It's like getting them from day one to be like, okay, when you're setting up your accounts, do it like this.
Well, I think this is sort of one of the joy of password managers, because it's one of the rare occasions where we get to say there is something that will make your security better, but it will also make your life better in terms of how you use a system. I mean, there's lots of good security stuff out there that makes life harder. 2FA, I love 2FA, and I have 2FA turned on all my things, but it is something else I need to do in addition to everything else, and I understand the usability barrier. I love showing people something like, here is how I log on to a mobile app with 1Password. I literally click the button and I Face ID myself to the phone, job done. That's easier than you typing your terrible password. And I love the fact that you can kind of take people on that journey based on something that actually makes their life better on a day-to-day basis, and not just, hackers might get your password. You should do this just in case.
The difficult thing is always slowing down that process so they understand what's happening, because it always happens too fast. You hang Face ID and it just bam, and you're in. And then someone is like, actually, like, let me do that again so I can see it.
So I've got a conference talk where I think I'm logging into Instagram with it. And that the thing happens so quickly, and I'm really conscious that people won't actually see and understand the whole thing, and I narrate it in real time. And it's like, I just got to the end of that. You didn't understand it all. All you need to know is I just logged onto the website and I didn't have to do anything other than look at the phone. And it happened so quickly, it was even hard to explain. Now go and take some time to learn how this works.
That's awesome. So pivoting a bit onto, like, trusting things online and where you put in your passwords. Trust always seems to be like an issue online. People blindly trust things that they shouldn't. How do you instill like a questioning nature in your company without, one, getting out a conspiracy theory book, or two, just saying, like, never click links? Like, any links, just put it in yourself.
Well, look, this is kind of the hard thing, because if you never click links, it's going to get really hard to do your job as well. I mean, imagine you have like, I want to do a password reset. I get sent a link. Well, what are you going to do? Well, maybe you could manually type out the token in the URL. That's not much fun. I think we've got to kind of look at the trust thing a little bit differently. And one of the questions I get a lot is people sort of say, okay, well, I'm only going to enter my credentials into, say, a website I trust. And you go, okay, well, how do you define that? Like, have a look at the front page of Have I Been Pwned, look at some of the brands in there. Would you trust them? Yeah, of course I trust them. Well, here's all their data. Conversely, I often have people say, well, how do I know I can trust Have I Been Pwned before I use it? It's like, well, all you got to do is enter your email address. I'm not asking for your like deepest, darkest secrets. It's just an email address. And I think this sort of starts to lead in the direction I wanted to go, which is you've got to decide what risks you're going to take with any system, whether you think it's trustworthy or not, because we know even the biggest brands in the world can have data breaches. And what I mean by that is like I'm really conscious about what information I share with a service. I use social media and I use privacy settings in order to only target things to some of my friends. But I assume that maybe that's going to go wrong one day. So if I post a photo of the kids, for example, I would only post a photo of the kids that I would be willing to accept could one day be public. There are lots of moments I have in my life which I don't want to take that risk with, even if I very, very carefully target it at the audience I want to have it. So I think the whole trust thing is like, okay, there's certainly a bar. There are certain services I think you should never give any personal information to. But even the ones that I, quote unquote, trust, I'm still going to work on the assumption that one day they might lose that data.
I think that in just recently in the last couple of weeks is very true, right? Facebook have almost dumped everything that they own now publicly.
I mean, Facebook's a good example. If you're listening to this and you're not sure of what date it is, it could be just about any date, because we could have had this discussion so many times over the last couple of years about stuff leaked from Facebook. Look, it's kind of interesting too, because I will often see people say, well, Troy, you're obviously going to delete your Facebook account now because of such and such an incident. And I sort of go, well, no, I'm not, because I like seeing my friends' kids on the other side of the world. I like seeing the experiences my friends are having. I like them being able to see my experiences. But I'm just very, very selective about how I use it. I acknowledge that this is like a massive platform and there's a gazillion things that can go wrong. And it's very, very easy to get something like a privacy setting wrong. So I just use it in a way where I expect things might be public. I don't want that to happen, but if it does, it's not going to cause me any harm.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect way to use tools like that.
I don't want to deprive myself of the pleasure that I do get out of the social media platforms.
Mm-hmm. So what sort of tools can businesses use to help keep their their data safe? So like not kind of social media and stuff like that, but like the hardcore business data that you really don't want to get out. And how do you think these tools can be integrated into the culture of the business? Because it's one thing to kind of introduce something and be like, okay, this is encrypted storage, or this is any number of these tools, but it's very different to say, okay, we're going to introduce two-factor on this, and the user experience is maybe not great, but it needs to be almost mandated across the company.
Yeah.
How do you kind of integrate them closer into the culture of a business, do you think?
It's kind of interesting for business as opposed to consumer, because when it's consumer, let's take something like two-factor. If you're a website, let's say you're Dropbox, right? So Dropbox apparently has a 2FA adoption rate of about 1%, which is really, really, really low. Now, as a business, they're not going to want to turn around and go, okay, everyone has to have it, because they'll lose customers and people won't log in. But if you are an organization that has, let's say you've got 1,000 staff, for argument's sake, you are actually in a position to sort of start to dictate the way they use internal systems. So I think we got to look at both the carrot and the stick here. So the stick is you could sort of say, okay, look, everyone's going to have 2FA. You're all going to have to live with it because it does make a big difference. And you're our people using our systems. We can say this. I think the carrot, if you like, is that we do have 2FA implementations today that actually make it much easier for people to do things like authenticate to their machines. So particularly when you think about things like U2F, I mean, U2F is a beautiful mechanism for authentication. We've got lots of NFC-style devices where we can sort of sit down at PSC, go bang, I want to log on, and job's done. You're in. Obviously, all sorts of different implementations within the likes of Windows 10 have improved a lot recently. So I think we're starting to get ways where it's almost like the password manager discussion before, where we can be more secure and also do it in a way where the usability not only doesn't suffer, but in some places improves. I'm talking on my iPhone at the moment. I've got Face ID to authenticate biometrically without having to enter a PIN. I've got my Windows PC there, which has got Windows Hello because it's got one of the biometric cameras from Logitech, so I can do the whole face thing on both of these. These are wonderful ways of authenticating that make my life easier and make my devices more secure as well.
Yeah, I know. Is it Google that actually have keys that they give to everyone, and that's your kind of, you can go to any machine in Google and kind of unlock it as you with this key. I wonder whether that's because there's almost an inherent knowledge that you are technical if you join a company like that. I wonder how these levels of security start building up in smaller companies, when you're not Google, but you're a 5-man, 5-woman law firm.
I almost wonder if it's a bit easier for a small organization and that you've only got to get 5 people to do this, like you're not trying to move 1,000 people at once into like a 2FA implementation. I think if I was sort of starting up a company today, or if I was, the CISO of the 5-person company, all right, it's not a big responsibility, but it's 5 people. Yeah, by the time you sort of start to look at all the different cloud services you've got today, for everything from the operating system through to the desktop software, and the ways you have to authenticate, and the fact that you've only got to go out and get 5, U2F style tokens, it seems now like an easy win to actually start with a greenfield implementation, which is really, really solid straight out of the box. If you think about it, even 5 years ago, the difficulty in doing that would have been much higher, but now we've got so many services and tools available. It seems a lot easier to get off on the right foot.
Yeah, in a company like that, it must be very interesting, those internal initial discussions that they sometimes actually come down to, hey, we should just have an Excel spreadsheet full of passwords. I would love to be on that initial meeting where they set up a Google Doc and share it within the company, and are like, yeah, access management.
So it seems like a good idea at the time. But, again, for an organization that size, like, it's so easy to do things right off the bat, to have a proper enterprise-grade password manager and to get everyone on it. And I'll tell you what, it'd be a lot easier to, like, gradually add more staff members to an implementation designed specifically for teams than what it would be to get to the point where everyone's dependent on this Google Docs and all the passwords are in there. And it's, okay, now we've actually got to make an organizational wide change that impacts a large number of people.
Yeah, I mean, we have businesses anywhere from 8 people to, we have 3 companies now around 300,000 people. And like the adoption rate is crazy how kind of, people are using this inside a business, and it just grows. It's really nice to see that adoption, even when it's not mandated, is really fast once you kind of get used to the concept and you kind of acknowledge.
Yeah, in those cases, and I know you're meant to be interviewing me, but I've got a question, and I think this is relevant. In those cases, the individuals are getting like home licenses so that they can go home and use 1Password as well, right?
Yeah, so our business plans, they all come with a family account. So that's adding not just yourself from a personal point of view, and all the information is kept separate.
This is what I find interesting, because it's like totally standalone. It's not like, we can link everything up. So the value proposition there is in the humans developing the patterns of both the enterprise and home, even though they're totally separate instances. But it's like, well, you're still the wrong person. And I just think it's really interesting the way traditionally in the enterprise it's been like, this is home and this is work, and never the two shall meet, and they're totally different things. And you kind of forget the fact that, you're a person bringing your behaviors and your security hygiene from home to work and vice versa, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's all about developing habits. And, if we can develop a person's habits, they can then move those to another company when they leave or when they move on or anything. And that's really important from a kind of global security point of view, of just improving the world's password habits and getting these things set up. So yeah, you get a free family account with the business account. They're only linked via payment. But what's interesting about that as well is you also get other family members that you can add to that. So it's a family account with 5 people. So essentially, in a company of 300,000 people, if you think, average family size of 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever, like that's a lot of people that are then using a password manager, which is awesome.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that's a really good result.
So we've talked a bit about kind of prevention, but with all the data breaches that are happening, and the kind of almost inevitability of some of them, what's the first thing that an organization should do if they suspect a data breach, or they know that one has occurred? And is there, like, do you look up to something that's happened and be like, yeah, that's exactly the way to handle it?
Yes, and I look at other ones and they're completely the opposite. So they're a goodie. Let's focus on the positives. There was a data breach in Australia a few years ago of the Red Cross blood service, and this was a really interesting one. So someone on the internet, someone who wanted to be anonymous, I don't know who they were, popped up and said, look, I've got the Australian Red Cross blood service data. And I was like, okay, that could be interesting. I'm going to have to verify this and everything. And the guy says, well, you're in there, so you can look at your own record, because I had donated blood in the past. And he sent me my own record, and it was my name, my correct date of birth, which some people know, but I don't publicise it around. And also when I donated blood. And I was like, oh man, here we go again. Yeah, that's me. And it was actually legitimate. And it was actually very difficult when I saw this data, because it wasn't just, it was actually data about 550,000 Australians, which was the largest data breach we've ever had in Australia. And it wasn't sort of just the data itself, but it was about a process which is kind of medically related. There were blood types in there. And I don't know exactly what a hacker's going to do with a blood type, but it is medical data, which then becomes a much more sensitive class of information. And it feels kind of uncomfortable to think that your own blood type's out there. Plus, they had all the eligibility questions for donating blood, and some of those get very, very sensitive because they get into your personal health situation. So I had to disclose that to the organisation, and I ended up doing it through AusCert, which is an organisation in Australia that provides services to a bunch of Aussie businesses around the InfoSec space. And AusCert helped the Red Cross Blood Service do the most sensational breach disclosure I think I've still seen to date. So within the period of only 72 hours from the time I disclosed it to AusCert, they managed to not only figure out what on earth had happened, so someone had literally just taken a database backup and put it on a testing environment publicly facing. And that was all it was. So it was that simple. So I figured out what happened, closed the hole, which is obviously one of the most important things after a data breach, and then prepared all the communications. And it's the communication that I often see organisations getting really, really wrong. So I see organisations blaming the people that reported it, doing anything they can to shift responsibility from themselves to other people, downplaying the severity of it. The Australian Red Cross Blood Service, on the other hand, had their CEO doing a press release within about 72 hours. She was like literally there on TV talking about the incident. She was very apologetic. And I don't know why seems to be such a big thing for me. I mean, maybe it's because I've got kids and I always tell them to say sorry if they do something wrong. But yeah, she was literally there on TV saying, we take full responsibility. We're very apologetic. Here's what happened. Here's what we're doing about it. They had call centers set up to receive queries from customers. And the whole thing went enormously smoothly for what was actually a bad incident. And I now see this incident used all over the world as sort of breach disclosure best practice. And I wrote about it at the time as well. If you Google my name and Red Cross Blood Service, you'll see what it is that they did well. And that to me has sort of become the gold standard. And it shows that you can actually have one of these incidents, do a good job of handling it, and come out looking pretty good on the other side.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And yeah, that's horrifying, the kind of phishing I can imagine. Like, when someone gets a hold of an old password and they kind of phish you, trying to say that they have access to an account because they have that password, what the mind wanders at, like, things that they could do with your blood type and some eligibility questions and stuff like that. It's that's certainly a nasty one.
Well, fortunately in that case, that they did have access to logs, and they were pretty confident that this file was only retrieved by the one person who sent it to me, and they were pretty confident this one person, certainly myself, had permanently deleted every trace of the data. And they were actually able to go out there and say, look, we're very confident that this data is not out there in the wild anymore, which is very different to a lot of the other big breaches we see, where it's like, well, actually, there's like tens, hundreds, in the case of something like Ashley Madison, probably hundreds of thousands of people out there that now have that data in their possession. That's a genie that just doesn't go back in the bottle.
What I like about that is, even though they were fairly certain it wasn't out in the open, they still disclosed this, was very public, and apologized. It's a mirror image from, I know we're mentioning Facebook again, but that when they had a leak of customer data, that they said it was internal only, and they said up to 20,000 employees had access to this test load of data that was moved on to like a clear text search and stuff, and there was no apology in that. Like there was a very definite kind of different tone of, it's all right, it's fine, and I think that's the night and day between the two of them. Is it's really interesting to see how a company behaves in this sort of situation.
I think we're starting to see a little bit of a shift here. There's like anecdotally my feelings. The penny for me sort of dropped after the Uber incident. So in 2017, late 2017, Uber said, look, a year ago we had what really was a data breach, and then it was an attempted shakedown and extortion, and they passed it off as a bug bounty. But they kind of came clean about this. And a lot of people were very upset. And this wasn't long after the Equifax situation as well, which really wasn't handled very well. And the thing that I really started to find there, a combination of those two organizations dealing with it very badly, and then other organizations like Dropbox and Imager dealing with their, it's actually not Dropbox, Discuss, the commenting engine, and Imager dealing with their breaches very, very well, is I was noticing a shift where people now seem to judge organizations less harshly for having had a data breach, but more harshly if they don't deal with it in the right way. And it's interesting to sort of look back at those incidents and think about the way the organizations were judged. And now today we see incidents like there was a recent one for GitHub, and there was another one for Twitter where they inadvertently logged passwords in the clear. They were storing them as good cryptographic hashes under normal operating circumstances, but inevitably they had some process which was capturing authentication attempts, grabbing credentials, dumping them in a log file. They figured it out later on. No evidence that the log file had ever been exposed anywhere else, but they still came forward and said, hey, look, something happened. Here's what we know about it. We're confident it hasn't been seen elsewhere. That's the sort of thing they could have brushed under the carpet pretty easily, but there'd probably be a bunch of different people in those different organizations that knew about it, and if ever they leaked that information later on, then they'd look bad. So it's almost like they've gone on the front foot and went, okay, let's talk about what happened. There's no real impact. And everyone seems to have sort of forgotten about that and moved on pretty quickly.
Do you think GDPR and the European standards and stuff are improving this disclosure? Because I know there's some rules in that basically say disclose it, like you have to. And do you think that's kind of helping in terms of other businesses around the world that might also have accounts in Europe, kind of allow them to disclose more freely, or force them to disclose more freely?
It's a good question, because I've heard some people say it could go the other way as well, where it's like, look, because the penalties are so high now, for some organizations they're not going to want to disclose because they could get hit with 4% of gross annual worldwide turnover, which is also not a very nice prospect. Look, it would be really interesting to see reliable, tangible figures. Now, we might be seeing a bit more disclosure. That doesn't necessarily mean that as a ratio, it's actually improved. I've certainly seen a few things sort of not living up to expectations. So my great hope for GDPR was, look, this is going to start to really penalize organizations that blatantly do the wrong thing. My hope also was that it'd kind of be a bit of a rising tide everywhere, regardless of whether you're in Europe or somewhere else, because of course extraterritoriality could still come under that scope. But what I've seen in a number of cases as well is people making reports to regulators about their data being mishandled in other parts of the world, and the regulator saying, well, they're overseas, it'd be really hard to bring an enforcement case against them. And people have gotten quite upset about that, because they're like, yes, but I'm a European data subject. Like, I'm meant to get all of these rights, even when the thing's running on the other side of the world. But the difficulty of enforcing that is quite hard. Now, mind you, if it's a company like Facebook, it's like, well, you are massive and you have physical presences all over the world and lots of them in Europe. There's a lot of levers that can be pulled there. But if you're, say, a data aggregator based in the US and you don't handle the information right and you have this San Fran headquarters, well, the overhead and the difficulty of bringing a case against them now does actually make it quite hard. So I think it really does depend on the use case, but on the whole, like, surely it can only make things better. I mean, even if we just said, look, all the European companies as a start are going to do a lot better, that again is going to be a bit of a rising tide across the breadth of services we use.
Yeah, that's it's fascinating. I wonder if that kind of changes over time as people understand, more about GDPR. Because I think everybody's still kind of, especially with other European laws that have come in terms of like the cookie law and stuff like this. There's been an immediate there's been an immediate kind of reaction to it, and then it's kind of simmered down a little. I wonder if we start to see that and start to kind of only see really major data breaches actually incur fines, and the other ones kind of quietly go by.
Well, anecdotally, so we're almost a year in since GDPR hit, and anecdotally, I'm seeing things being pretty quiet on that front. I mean, in the lead up, everyone was getting very, very excited about it for all sorts of reasons, and then it kind of hit, and there was a lot of fuss just before it hit. Remember, things like US newspapers were going, "Oh, you're from Europe, you can't read the paper anymore," and it had all these other weird effects. And then it hit, and then things started to simmer down really quickly. And to be honest, it's very rare I see anyone talking about it today, certainly compared to in the lead up. I would like to get a lot more parity across the world. So I lament the fact that because I'm an Australian, apparently I don't get the same rights. Like even if we're both talking about a European service, like you're going to get much better protection when your data appears in a US data breach than what I would. And that just seems a bit about front to me. Australia, we did actually get our data mandatory reporting laws last year. We got our notifiable data breach scheme, but it's really out of whack because you look at GDPR and they're like, okay, well, you've got to report to your local regulator within 72 hours if you have an incident. Australia's very casual. They're like, oh, you got a month. Don't worry about it. It's like, why must I get like 1/10 of the timeline that you get, or 10 times longer than what you get? That doesn't seem fair to me as an Aussie.
Yeah, it's horrifying to think that people watching this video back in like maybe a year's time, and I wonder what kind of rights that I have in the UK at that point. I wonder, how many of these that they rewrite and remove from Europe. So yeah, that's a horrible thing to end on, but I think it's a great place to finish. If
Good luck with that.
If people want to find out more about you or follow you on social media, where can they go?
Twitter, Troy Hunt, or troyhunt.com in your browser.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. And people out there on the internet, make sure to follow Troy Hunt, but also to watch our other series of videos that we have. We've got 2 more coming out, and maybe we're going to do some more after that. So.